B'Tz Hashem, we begin the fifth parak of Chullin. The Torah tells us in Vayikra Chaf Beis, V'shar oseh oso v'yespino lo sishchatu b'yom echad. So we're not allowed to slaughter both the mother and its offspring on the same day. And the Torah prohibits seh or shar. So let's begin with the Mishnah. Also v'yespino noeg Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, bein b'fnei abayis, b'shalo b'fnei abayis, b'chulin u'b'mikdashim. The chiddush of the Mishnah, as we'll see in the Gemara, is that the Iser applies even in the case of mukdashim. And once the Iser applies to mukdashim, so you have two animals that are kodesh, you have the mother and the child, and you're not allowed to slaughter both of them on the same day. Now, we might have thought that if that be the case, then dafka when the bias stands, we have mukdashim. But the Mishnah says bechulin ubemukdashim, which means that the Isser applies even to chulin. And if that be the case, then even shalo b'fnei abayis, the Isser applies. Now, in general, why do we have to say bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutzatz? That distinction or the possibility of distinguishing between aretz and chutzatz only applies to what's called a chovas karka. And clearly, we're not dealing here with chovas karka, we're dealing with shechting behemos. So it seems obvious that the Isser here of oso vespino, which is a chovas gavra, has nothing to do with the karka, would apply even in chutz la'aretz. But once the Mishnah already has to tell you b'fnei abayis and shalo b'fnei abayis, so in a symmetrical way, it'll tell you bein ba'aretz u'bein b'chutz la'aretz. But the main chiddush is that applies even shalo b'fnei abayis when we don't have mukdashim. Now, the Mishnah goes on and asks ketzad, meaning, what are the various scenarios that might come to be? And the Mishnah is going to go through many, many different possible cases and find out whether or not the shechita is kshera, whether or not there's a chiv malchus. Ha-shochet oso ves beno. Now, the first case is chulin bachutz. He shechts two animals that are both chulin outside of the azara. So therefore, obviously each shechita in and of itself should be valid, and that's called shnei b'ksherim. But hasheni sofeges harboim, for the second shechita, or if there was a second shochet, he also will be chayev malchus for violating oso vespino. Again, in this case, you have to give him asra and tell him you're not allowed to shech this animal because we already shechted the mother. He doesn't necessarily know that they shechted the mother that day, but through the asra, he'll find out about it. And once he finds out about it, then if he goes ahead and he flaunts the hasra and he shechts the vlad, then he's chayev malchus. So that's more or less the simple, straightforward case. Now, we should emphasize that when it says here, Shneim Ksherim, you might have thought that maybe since, at least with regard to the second shechita was done the Iser, and it was a violation of the lav of Oso Vespino, you might have thought that therefore the shchita itself should be a shchita psula. And the Torah says lo sochlu kol toeva, so maybe you might think this is called a toeva because you violated an Isur Lav Yechav Malkus for the second shechita. That might be a toeva, and you're not allowed to eat the meat. The Mishnah tells you no, you're allowed to eat the meat, and there's no reason to forbid eating the meat because the shechita per se was a perfectly good shechita. He gets malchus for violating the law, but that doesn't undermine the shechita. Then we go on. Kodshim bachutz. Now we're talking about a case where both the mother and the vlad are kodshim, and they were shechted outside the azar. That's called shchutei chutz. Now, with regard to shchutei chutz, the Torah says that you've shecht kodshim bachutz yichayiv kares, and therefore harishon chayiv kares. Now, what about the sheni? Why shouldn't the sheni be chayiv kares for kodshim bachutz? And the answer is that when the Torah prohibits kodshim bachutz, it's because you didn't bring it on the mizbeach. And therefore, the Isur of Kodshim Bachutz only applies when the Kodesh is royal mizbeach. But in the case of the second shochet, since the animal is not royal shechita because the Torah prohibits that shechita, you already shechted the mother, therefore, that second shechita is not royal lavo bifnim. And therefore, there's no violation of shchutei chutz. However, Shneim Psulim, even though he didn't violate Shchutei Chutz in the case of the second Shochet, but nevertheless, it passes the Kodshim. Because once you shecht Kodshim Bachutz, whether or not you're chayav for that, because it's roy lavo b'fnim, or it's not chayav because it's not roy lavo b'chutz, but nevertheless, you shechted a Bachutz. And if you shechted a Bachutz, that passes the korban. Now, Shneim Sofkim Arbon, the first and the second are Chayiv Malkus, but for two different reasons. The first is Chayiv Malkus because of Shchutei Chutz. Now, even though the first is Chayiv Kares, but if they gave Masra, then he's Chayiv Malkus. Because that's the law with regard to any Chayiv Kares. If you got Malkus, if you got a Hasra for Malkus, you Chayiv Malkus. The second shochet for the second animal, he's chayav arboim, but not for shchutei chutz, because as we said before, it was eno roy lavo bifnim, but rather for oso vespino. And we go on. Chullin bifnim, both animals were chullin, but they shechted it inside the azara. And that's called the Isur of chullin bazara. And here, Shneim Psulim, if you shecht in the Azara Chulin, then it's forevermore Pasul Mizbeach, because it was Chulin. And in order for the Shechita to be a meaningful, valid Shechita in Kodshim, it's got to be Kodshim, but here it was Chulin. And of course, the same logic is applied to the second shechita because it was chulin be'azara, and if you shech chulin be'azara, that's posel mizbeach. However, here we're going to make a difference as far as malchus is concerned. Hasheni sofek es arboim. Now this means that if you shech chulin be'azara, you don't get malchus. And therefore, the first shochet is not going to get malchus. The second shochet will get malchus for oso vespino. But as far as chulin bazar is concerned, there's no malchus. And this, Rashi tells us, is based on a Gemara Kiddushin on Daf Nun Zayin Amid Beis, that chulin shenishketu bazara, although they're osir ba'ano, but you don't get malchus. And the reason for that is because it's not an Averis Halav, but rather it's an Isur Aseh. And the Torah commands you to bring Kodshim into the Azara. And if you bring Chullin into the Azara, then you have not fulfilled your mitzvah, but you don't get Malchus for that. Kodshim Bifnim, we go on in the Mishnah. He has two animals that are Kodshim, and they're both shechted inside the Azara. Perfect. Harishon kosher upata. The first one is a valid shchita of kodshim, and for sure he hasn't violated any isur whatsoever. The Mishnah didn't even have to say that he's potter; it's obvious. But hasheni sofik zarboim, the second shochet will get malchus for also v'espino uposel. Now, why is the second shchita posel? And the answer is because it's mechusar zman. What is mechusar zman? If you shecht kodshim before the time is ripe for that kodshim, that shchita is a shchita psula. And here, we would have to wait at least another day before we could shecht this kodshim because of the isur lav of osov espino. We go on. Chullin v'kodshim bachutz. He's got two animals. One is Chullin, the other is Kodshim, and he shechts them both outside the Azara. Now, the first one that he shechted was a perfectly valid shechita. It was Chullin, which he shechted outside the Azara, which is exactly what he has to do. And therefore, Rishon Kosher Upota. Hasheni, Sofeg Eshar Boim, that I understand because the Sheni violated the Isur of Oso V'es Bino. Uposel, because Kodshim that was shechted outside the Azara, that's an invalid Shchita, and therefore the carbon is posel. Kodshim V'chulin Bachutz, he's got two animals, but now he does it in the reverse. He shechts the first animal, which is kodshim bachutz, and that's shchitas kodshim bachutz, which, as we said before, as opposed to chulin bazor, generates a chiv kares. So the rishon is chayiv kares, and posel, he pasels through that shchita the kodshim, because kodshim that was shechted outside the azora are posel. Vasheni kosher, the second shchita, there's nothing wrong with the shchita. As we said before, even if you violate the isur of oso vespino with the second shchita, nevertheless it doesn't passel the shchita. The shchita is a perfectly good shchita. And therefore you're allowed to eat the meat. Shneim sofkin is arbaim. So the first one gets
I don't understand why you can't start on time.
second
And
half.
Shlomo Moskowitz is making fun of him the whole time.
I have to figure out how to mute this. I used to know how to do this. Let's see. Okay, I think I managed. So why do they both get Malchus? Obviously, the second one gets Malchus for Osav Espino. And the first one, even though he was Chayav Kares, for Shchutei Chutz, for Kodshim Bachutz, nevertheless, as we said before, every single Chayav Kares generates Malchus if he had Asra. Chullin v'Kodshim Bifnim. He's got two animals. One is Chullin, the other is Kodshim, and he shechts them both inside the Azara. Now, the first one is Chullin Bazara, we said before, that passes the carbon. But what about the second shchita, which was done on Kodshim Bifnim? That seems to be a perfectly good shchita, but no, the Mishnah says it's possible. Why is it possible? Because mechusar zman, as we said before, he has to wait till tomorrow to do that shchita. Hasheni sofek es arboim. As we said before, Chullin Bazara is only an Iser essay, but not a lav, so you don't get Malchus, but he gets Malchus for Oso Ves Beno. Kodshim v'Chulin b'fnim, he's got two animals. One is Kodshim, the other is Chulin, and he shechts both of them b'fnim. Harishon kosher upoter. Obviously, the first one, he did exactly kill Chasa. What are you supposed to do? He shechted a carbon b'fnim. However, Hasheni Sofikas Abayim Uposel. The second one gets Malchus for Oso Vies Beno. He will not get Malchus for Chulin Bifnim because, just one second. Because Chulin Bazar doesn't generate Malchus, as we said. Uposel. But he did a shchit on Chulin, it wasn't Kodesh, and therefore the carbon is posel. Chulin bachutz ubifnim, both animals are Chulin. One was shechted bachutz, which is perfectly okay, or rishon kosher upoter. The second Chulin was shechted inside. That's going to passel the shchita because you can't shecht Chulin inside the Azara as a valid shchita for Kodshiv. He wasn't makdish it. Hasheni sofik es arboim for oso vespino uposel. Kodshim bachutz ubifnim. Both of the animals are kodshim. Bachutz ubifnim means the first one he shechted kodshim bachutz. And for kodshim bachutz, we said you get kares. And you get malchus if there was asra from malchus. And bachutz, the second shchita, he shechted bifnim, right? The second animal he shechted bifnim, and it was kodshim. So Shneim Sofigas Harboim, he gets Malchus for also Viespino. He doesn't get Malchus for Shechtin Kodshim Bifnim, but Psulim, because once again, it's Mechusar Zman. It's not Roy Lovo LePesach HaMizbeah. Chulin bifnim ubachutz. Both animals are chulin. He shechs the first one bifnim and the second one bachutz. Harishon posel upotur. Right, chulin bifnim is posel, but we said the chulin bazara does not generate malchus. Carbon is posel. The sheni, of course, is going to get malchus for oso vesbino. But v'kosher, because it's a carbon chulin. And we said that even the violation of oso vespino does not undermine the validity of the shchita. Kodshim bifnim ubachutz, both animals are kodshim, and he shechs the first one bifnim, and the second one bachutz. So the kodshim that he shechted bifnim is perfect kehol chosa. That's exactly what he has to do. Rishon kosher potter. The second one is certainly a violation of oso vespino v'asheni sofik es arboim. And not only that, posel. Why? Because it's mechusar zman, and it's not roy lovo lefnei mizbeach, because he already shechted on that day the mother. Now we start the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan.
Rabbi,
Yeah, sorry.
this applies to an oath as well?
No. The
Okay.
Torah says shor oseh.
Okay.
It's got to be a shor oseh. We're going to soon see a discussion in the Gemara if he crossbreeds a shor and a seh, or any two species, like, for example, a goat and a sheep, whether or not the child or the vlad from that intermarriage, is included in the oso vespino. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brayso, minayin leoso vespino shenoig b'mukdashim. Maybe the Torah would say that Osav Espino only applies in Chullin, Talmud Lomar. And here we have to see the pasuk inside. There are two psukim near each other. The first pasuk says Shar o Kesev o Eis ki Voled, and the subject of that pasuk is Kodshim, Uksiv Basrei, and almost immediately afterwards the pasuk says V'shar se Osav Espinolo Sishku B'yom Echad, and now we're going to make an equation here, and we're going to bridge between the kodshim in the first pasuk of Sharo Keves Oez and the Iser of Osav Espino in the second pasuk. Limed is going to teach us al Osav Espino shenoig b'mukdash. And there's no machlokas about this, as we saw in the Mishnah, Stam Mishnah. But now the Gemara says, well, if you're interpreting the second pasuk of the Iser Osav Espino in light of the first pasuk, the subject of which is Kodshim, Ema, maybe we should say b'mukdashim in, b'chulin lo. Maybe on the contrary, let's go to the other polar extreme and say that Osav Espino only applies to Kodshim and not to Chulin. And the Gemara answers, Shar hifsika inyan. The Torah repeats Shar Oseh twice. Let me see if I can read you the pasuk. It says Shar o Kesev o Eis ki Voled. That's the first pasuk, and the next pasuk it says Shar Oseh Osav Espino. Why did the Torah have to repeat Shar Oseh? It could have just said Osav Espino lo Sishchat, because the Osav Espino would refer to the previous pasuk, which explicitly says Shar o Keves. So that's called Hifsika Inya, that the Torah now is cutting away the relationship, the contiguity between the second pasuk and the first. So now the Gemara asks V'yema b'chulin in b'mukdashin lo. Now we go back a full 180 degrees to our original question. Maybe the Iser of Osav Espino is limited to chulin, doesn't apply to kodshim because hifsika inyat. The Gemara answers ksiv vishar. There's an extra vav, and with regard to a vav, we have a principle called vav mosif al inyan rishon. The vav tells me that we're about to introduce is added as an extension of that which came before it. So therefore, in addition to kodshim, now we're going into chulin. But in both kodshim and chulin, we have the iser of Osav Espino. Gemara says, "Ima kodshim kelayim lo." How far do you want to take this equation between chulin and kodshim? If you're saying that the whole background and the whole introduction to Osav Espino is kodshim, then maybe we should say in the case of kilayim, which means if, let's say, you crossbreed a goat and a sheep, then that vlad should be excluded from the lav of Osav Espino, and you could slaughter both the mother and the child on the same day, because in kodshim, kilayim is excluded from kodshim. And not only that, we have a brisa that says that b'kalayim Osav Espino noeg b'kalayim u'b'koi. Now, exactly what koi is, we'll get in Mirz Hashem to that tomorrow. Koi is a kind of an animal that's not a behemoth, it's not a chaya. It's what we call a birya b'fnei atzma. It's a separate creation. But whatever it is, there's no kodshim, neither in kilayim nor in koi. And how does the Brisa know? That's sexiv. Right? We have the word seh. And we're going to see that Rava has a whole drush about the word seh. So actually, the Gemara is asking two questions. The first question is that if you equate kodshim and chulin because of the smichus haparshios, smichus hapsukim, in Osav Espino, then we should exclude kilayim from Osav Espino. That's question number one. V'od, and furthermore, with regard to Osav Espino, the Torah says seh. V'omar Rava. Now we're going to see a principle of Rava, what does the word set teach me in Kol HaTorah Kula?